to Ali Yamashita's and Martin Despang's show Urban Transcendence. Today's show is from a very special place with a very special guest, and the context is that when Jay charged me with what to feature in our Urban Transcendence, he obviously mentioned architects, and he also mentioned building industries, so the people who think architecture and people who make architecture. And thirdly, he mentioned artists. So we had architects. In fact, we had emerging architects, so colleagues, practicing architects are yet to come. But the last two shows, actually the last three shows, were about the making of architecture. They were about materiality. And the last two ones were from the Institute of Wood Technology in Dresden. So it was dedicated to the building material of wood. So it's a great pleasure to have the first artist in our show. Again, I was sent out into the world, so we're broadcasting again from 12 hours off and half around the world. We're still in Dresden, Germany. And Dresden, Germany, more specifically the suburb, I shouldn't say that, the little town close to Dresden is called Radebeul. And Radebeul is the current residence of today's guest, Brian Curling. So thank you very much for being on our show, Brian.
Thanks for
and
invitation.
you're hosting us in your atelier here, which is a great honor and pleasure. And as you guys can see, it's a wonderful place that we will hear a little bit more about. I just the little things I want to share with you about Brian, who's an internationally both practicing and educating artists. I call us practicators for the reason of that we're practicing and educating, so we're that kind of hybrid species. And so Brian is internationally known and internationally engaged. Just before we said this is a little, the challenge here is that he has to speak English now, which is his native language, but sort of almost the opposite to me. Since he has been living in Germany for a while, he isn't always practicing his native language, and for me it's obviously the opposite, or I don't even know how it is for me, but that's interesting. So, born and raised in Kentucky, in a very agricultural, rural setting, and later on having been educated in the U.S., which I will get to in a second, and then having been reaching out into the world, Finland, Helsinki, as well as Cairo, Egypt, and Radebeul, Germany. And the place where we could have met and probably should have met is Lincoln, Nebraska. I can say that still pretty well, Nebraska, which is something where you went to school and I went to school, and we almost overlapped, but irony-wise, we didn't meet, so it wasn't meant to be. We were meant to meet here in Radebeul, where you, in fact, a year ago gave a wonderful tour of your atelier that I was privileged to attend. So, with that little introduction of me introducing you, please tell us a little bit more about sort of your stages in your education and in your development of you as a human being and as an artist.
Well, it all began a very long time. As you mentioned, I was born and raised in an agricultural area in Kentucky. I think from the very beginning I was surrounded by nature and kind of moved at a pace in accord with nature. I also knew that I liked using my hands. So through a series of steps and missteps, I ended up at the University of Kentucky wanting to study landscape architecture. And
I didn't know that.
The constrictions behind how you have to draw when you draw those plans was a little bit confining, and I started taking some art classes. So I came to art quite late. I always had an enjoyment of using my hands, like I said, materials, wood specifically. My father was a weekend carpenter, kind of furniture maker, and that kind of goes with the down months of the winter on a farm. You have to have something to do to keep you busy. And so yeah, I ended up taking a degree, a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree from the University of Kentucky in printmaking, book arts, and drawing. And those were, luckily enough, you could flow in between them quite easily. From bookmaking, I studied typography with a great professor, Jim Foose. Had the great chance through another professor of mine to attend the Tamarind Institute of Lithography, which is a well-known print publishing house in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I just kind of kept finding open doors. The next open door was, in Lincoln, Nebraska, where I went to study with Karen Kuntz, a very well-known American printmaker, specifically woodcut artist. She has this very interesting language in her own work that talks about development of kind of a scientifically defined society with a society that is agrarian. So that these kind of two things that are now melding into one another, but have actually quite different vocabularies. So she works like a lot of American printmakers. They have a heritage within abstract expressionism or abstraction, and then kind of negotiating their images through a private kind of language that involves the intellect and that which involves kind of experience. So those are kind of impulse points that I myself have taken on in my artwork. After 3 years in Nebraska, I moved to the Cleveland Art Institute after a wonderful stay in Helsinki. I was the first American artist that was invited by the Finnish Graphics Council to come to Helsinki for a number of months to make some work, and ended up, it of course has this huge tradition of wooden manufacturing, and was working in one of my architect heroes' hometown of Jyväskylä, of Alvaro Alavato, and so being around this use of materials was always engaging. It was, like all things in life, there are moments when it's quickly happening, and then there are pauses in between where people do other things, but the one consistent thing is that I've always been making prints. From Cleveland, I had the great chance to see a really beautiful woman, and happens to be my wife, and this is her first bedroom that we're now sitting in. So she was born in Radoboja, and it just was one of those really cool things that, fate, or whatever you want to call it or name it. So we decided, since she was here and I was in Kentucky, or Cleveland actually, that we would move to Cairo, Egypt. I got a chance to teach at the American University and run a gallery, and so we took off and went to Cairo. We're there for about 4 years, and just before the revolution we were to move back here, but it was on our own schedule, and we wanted to kind of do what we're doing now, work as two artists with our family, teach courses and workshops out of our studio, but also be in this environment of Radoboja. It's a very cultural or enculturated area where there's a lot of music, there's theater, there's art, there's a great tradition of it, and it's a beautiful landscape. So that kind of brings us to current. There's been some really great trips that I've been able to make as an artist to Japan a couple times, and last year I spent about 8 weeks at the foot of Mount Fuji as a residency. Some of the work that I'm going to show today is coming out of that time, or was ideas that were spawned out of that time. So there's it's there's been some very conscious decisions to make, like going to Cairo, and there have been other accidents that have happened that were also extremely important. So I think those are things that are I also think about in my artwork.
Yeah, that's great. We should also mention at that point, when you guys see this session here of the show, the beautiful shots of your work, the beautiful shots of the beautiful landscape that you mentioned. We owe this to Lutz Benke, who is behind the camera. He's the sort of the extension of Jay's and Ian's crew back in Honolulu, Hawaii, and he could just not witness anymore the kind of semi-professional way I was doing it, especially the last show. I have to apologize, because it's probably the worst ever. So he basically said, let's professionalize that. So thank you, Lutz, for assisting us, for producing us. It's a pleasure. So you know, Lutz will basically work in these impressions, so the audience can share and put sort of images to the words that we use to describe the kind of the beauty of the landscape here in Radebeul. So that's really interesting. Also, obviously the kind of connection to the material of wood that we both share a passion for. You mentioned Alba Alto. Lincoln, Nebraska is kind of interesting because there was no tree.
There's not many trees. I started drawing trees in Lincoln, Nebraska.
There was the prairie, and it was actually the Morton family who started to plant trees, and now it's pretty, nicely vegetated, and forested. So that's really interesting. So when we want to invite the audience to go on your website, obviously, maybe you can mention really quick. It's BrianCurling.com, isn't that simple?
It's Brian-curling.com.
Yeah.
It's you can find it pretty.
And
easy.
it's categorized, and by the many kind of different ways of working, but what you already mentioned is the woodcut sort of Holzschnitt, how we call that in Germany, which kind of stands out. And last year, when you gave this tour through the atelier, you very nicely sort of demonstrated to the visiting people how you basically make your art, and you also nicely volunteered to do that today for us. So next thing is that we're going to walk over and you're going to show us and demonstrate what a beautiful sort of immediate, creative way of engaging with the elements of wood it is. You work in a very archaic way, I would say. It's the tools, it's the chiseling, it's the raw. You asked me about, because you want to be open to the world. When we met, actually we meet mostly every morning when we're both running through the vineyards here, and then we have a little chat, and you asked me about if I know someone who would CNC or laser cut. So you're open to new technologies, but only after you have fully engaged and emerged with sort of the tradition of woodworking, which is by hand and by hand power and things taking time. It amazed me that both this place and your way of working is really kind of informed by sort of rediscovering slowness or taking time to do things. So it's a very slow pace that kind of, I think, is...
Sometimes that's helpful, and sometimes it's a hindrance.
Yeah. So that's very interesting. So maybe you talk a little bit about when people go to your website, you see a lot of talk, and you also have many visuals about landscape. One thing I saw is recently you also went on a trip just very recently to the Pacific Northwest, where you have a lot of impressions of the ocean and the land, and also some of your work talk about that. That's obviously a link to Hawaii, where in Hawaiian culture, both these elements and sort of their interplay are very important. So maybe you can share a little bit about your thoughts about the fascination, and sometimes even gets close to obsession with the elements of water and the land.
I'm reading some interesting texts right now from Friedrich Capra, and it talks about system views, and that we can't talk about one thing without including all the other factors that are going on. And landscape, and its complexity is something extremely intriguing to me. It's as an element in and of itself. We think of that, or we think of it as a building block, but it's not. It's a network of a lot of organisms and a lot of very interesting processes that are going on. And within that complexity, I always find that there are innumerable ways to think about the human condition by using the landscape perhaps as a metaphor. You can talk about horizons where there's something present and absent, but the air that surrounds the land is just as complex as the landscape itself, or the sea and all of its patterns and connections and the way that it functions with the landscape or with the mass of land. But I find those lines really interesting because they're physically a physical demarcation of where one visually stops, the other visually begins, but they're totally interdependent on one another. So currently, I'm looking at those points. Where is it that it goes from being part of one system or pattern into another? And using actual patterns. Geometry is a fundamental aspect to nature, and we can think about it as connections, as a lot of movement that has bindings between them and reactions. And so when I was going through the Pacific Northwest a couple of weeks ago, I drove from Seattle down to San Francisco. So I was surrounded by this enormous coast, and it's a very dynamic coast there, where the air actually becomes saturated with water, and where the land becomes fluid like water. So there's a lot of kind of movement back and forth of what is what here, and it's interesting. The way that I work is quite slow. You mentioned that. My thought process and the way that I kind of connect things in my own interest from my intellectual side, or that thing that I'm interested in, part of me, or the way that I respond to certain things that are going on in the world, they all take a little bit of time before they kind of come together. So the series I'm working on right now is actually a transition from winter to spring, or transitions. So that work that is to come from this experience of being in Seattle is kind of rattling around up here, but it's yet to take shape yet. I've been living here for 4 years. I've been working in this room for 4 years, and I think I'm just now starting to somehow arrive into being here. Before we were in Cairo with the whole different set of circumstances and equations from which to visually respond and psychologically respond and emotionally respond. So it took a while to move out of that influence and into being here. And
welcome again to...
I'm Hong Jiang, host for Asia in Review on Tuesdays.
And I'm David Day, host for Asian Review on Thursdays. Both of us broadcast our respective shows at 4 p.m.
And my topics tend to deal with questions related to environment, culture, history, and sometimes human rights.
And my shows tend to be on international business, foreign policy, geopolitics, and national security. And you can watch our shows live on the ThinkTech website at thinktechhawaii.com.
And you can also watch us on YouTube or Olalo.
So come join us on Thursdays at 4 p.m. I'm David Day.
And on Tuesdays at 4 p.m., I'm Hong Jiang.
Aloha.
Aloha.
So there's something inherent in the process. Printmaking comes originally from, China, and it was yeah, a marker of creativity from humans. We had a problem and we had to find a solution in order to overcome that challenge. And I mean, printing, we don't think a second about it now. We go to our printer, but it's all from an evolution of scratches on a piece of stone, and then with a fat crown and a piece of paper, transferring an image over to a different matrix. Here we have some very nice Japanese paper.
Which is very thin. So
Yeah, it's a
very.
I'll show you a little bit more about paper, but just the basic materials being, this is a cherry block where I've carved a tree motif here. With the cherry, this is, it's a hardwood where the grain of it is very close together. It doesn't have a lot of, this is an American cherry, so it has not so many blemishes in the wood, and so therefore you can plane it down to a really nice flat surface, and the detail that you can get from boards like this is greater than, say, a plywood board, which I'm using for the current prints. I use mostly tools from Japan, paper from Japan. Like I said, I've been to Japan, and Japanese, the Japanese technique of wood carving, printing influences my own work greatly. And I think there is something about also the Japanese aesthetic and to a certain degree the philosophy that I take also into this process. The process, in the end, is something I enjoy doing, something that my hands have become well versed at doing, but in the end, for the viewer, it has to be the image that's the important part. I make my things here in a very private room, pretty far removed from people, and but my pictures are the things that end up going out into the world. And the thing about printmaking, inherent in printmaking, is you can make multiples. So once I have this carved motif, then I can use a roller and some ink, or in the Japanese fashion, a brush and some rice paste and watercolor, and print, 100 copies or more, and send them around. And that was that kind of idea. It still is that idea of printing. Dissemination of information and communicating. So.
However, I have to say, when we walk over and we see the still pretty manual, hands-on way of producing from there, it's still, rather than a machine that is sort of perfected to make everyone look the same, I think it's here, if I'm not mistaken, the way how much of the ink or the material, the print material you apply. So still there is more sort of the notion of a unikit, that even though you duplicate, each and every one of them has a character that you can control is the wrong word, that you can influence, right?
And there's a very strong tradition of printmaking where number 1 looks just like number 10. I don't need that. I don't need that restriction. So I do play around in the addition. Some people would probably cringe what I would call an addition, because sometimes I would change colors, sometimes I would change the order of the blocks that are being printed. But it's in order to respond to that thing which is right in front of me. I think I use printing like a painter uses painting. It's to achieve an image, not to make a woodcut necessarily, or to make an oil painting. It is to make an image that, does that job which artists are doing, communicating something to the intellect or to the senses. So I don't. There are a lot of. I work with traditional things. There is a tradition, but we're living in a time where those things are extremely important, not to lose sight of, because we can pass those things along. But as an artist, I have a different role to play. I also have to respond to the things that are happening in my world at this time. Yeah. Here we are standing in front of the printing press that I use. It's a talkage press that has been everywhere basically with me. It started out in Kentucky, moved to Cleveland, flew to Egypt, was upside down on a taxi cab, much to my horror, and then made the flight to Germany and sits here. It's a real workhorse. It's an etching press, but I print mostly woodcuts on it. I've gotten a board here. What I'm working on right now, like I said, is a series of kind of pictures. So we'll get a little bit more into the aspects of those pictures and what they are. But I have here a woodcut in process. It's a reduction woodcut on plywood, and it's a finished plywood, so it has a birch veneer on top of it. And it's often used for lots of different types of industry type things, but I use it because the structure itself of the grain is pretty tight. It's a little softer to carve than the cherry wood, a lot less expensive, so I can work in larger scales, and it's a stable material. I think this is a 5 or 6 ply, meaning that when I start removing part of the top surface, it doesn't start warping. So that's those types of structural things with the wood are factors that I have to deal with very clearly, because when I'm printing a picture, there can be up to 20 colors on them, so the boards have to, and I have to line them up, register them, that is called in our printing language. So 1 millimeter off, or due to some warping, and you're seeing that kind of thing. So the color that I'm using is an oil-based printing ink. In Japan, you would use a water-based pigment, like a watercolor mixed with, or a dry pigment mixed with rice paste, and apply it with a brush. Today, I'm using more of a Western mode of using a roller and oil ink. It'll be the 5th color that's being printed on this small band of geometric grid here. It's very even, and where there's no blemishes like this little guy here on the roller, that'll end up showing up in the print. The way that I'm printing, it's very exact here, so it means that any little blemishes kind of disrupts the eye when looking at the image. So I'm trying to take care to craft this image to a very high standard, because I want the image itself to be the thing that people are responding to, not the mark of a hand necessarily. In this part, it's kind of this whole series is the organic and the geometric as one system, interdependent and interrelated. But in order for that to function, I can't have the geometry looking all kind of muddy. So I have here these lines that, again, every one of them I can line up at the same spot. Helps also, this paper is very thin, that I can actually kind of see through it. And adjust it kind of as I need to individually for each successive layer. Because in the process of printing, and when it has so much ink on it already, there's a tendency for the paper to stretch a little bit. So again, I need my buffer sheet here, the board to even out the pressure and not damage the board, the carved board underneath. And then engage the press, and it'll do the rest for us. So, technology hasn't really changed much in the last. The machines have gotten better, but the technology's kind of been patented for several hundred years. So here's that printed piece in the end.
Yeah, so the darker ones are the ones.
Yeah, so the darker ones here are the ones that we just printed, and it looks like we did a pretty good job with the help of our glasses to land it in the right spot.
Yeah.
So like I said, this is it's a powdered stone called mica, and some people would probably cringe to see the way that I do this, but
looks good to me.
well, thanks. That's what I wanted to hear. No, this is it's a technique that, you know, it's just like all things. You have certain desires or restrictions or wishes for how that image might end up, or building or music, compositional score, and you use the elements that you're aware of and that you can use, and you do that. You incorporate different things that maybe belong to different traditions, but since we're already an amalgamation of all other things that we've experienced, I think that I don't have any difficulty in mixing traditional processes with things that are necessary for me to make the best image that I can make. So there are 4 sheets of paper at work here, and multiple, you know, wood substrates that I'm printing from, carved images, found pieces of wood, but again, kind of layering these transparent layers up in order to kind of get that sense of depth and real world kind of experience. And the last one that I've completed in this series is this print here. So here we have, you know, 2 sets of informations printed, or 2 sets of information printed on various pieces of paper, again with this geometric portion of it. But to achieve, you know, this print means that I have one board for the back plant part, one part for the blooms, one part for the background, another part for the blooms, the more finely carved and detailed areas. So you see here that I do draw directly on the board and carve the information out. So I'm leaving what's red here in this case, and since they do get pretty complicated, the images, to keep it lined up. So I do make a transparency from a drawing, and then I separate those out onto the different boards, because in this case, I mean, I have 6 boards that are printed in...
Amazing.
Yeah, I find this actually quite interesting to know that these 2 things are actually the same in a not only a theoretical but also a physical sense.
I think that's the amazing part, that rationalizing that is one thing, but then through the act of making. And I've actually driven many of my student generations crazy with what I call, we talked about that before last year, a drawing on wood.
I'm Jake Fidel. That's Sharon Moriwaki of the Hawaii Energy Policy Forum. And every Wednesday we have Hawaii, the State of Clean Energy. We've been doing it for some time now, and we have some fantastic guests on there, unbelievable guests who give us insight into what is going on in a very complex, sometimes very confusing, sometimes very disappointing area of progress in the state. So we love doing this. We love meeting them. We love talking to them. We love having their ideas out on the table. So maybe, just maybe, we can all make some sense of what's going on. Sharon, what do you think?
I think that's absolutely correct. We enjoy ourselves meeting with all these people and hearing about the energy and the state of clean energy, and hopefully we advance clean energy for the state. So it's terrific. Join us.
Okay, it's every Wednesday. Okay, Wednesday is Energy Day. Every Wednesday, 4 to 5 p.m. Hawaii, the State of Clean Energy, here on ThinkTech Hawaii. We'll see you there. I'm Jay Fidel.
So Martin, we're shifting the way that we're still making a woodcut, but we're kind of getting away from using a carved image into using a found board here. There's a lot of we were just talking about material in wood, there's a substance in wood that one can look at and kind of say that the grain invokes a sense of atmosphere. So I do, this is the other part of that image that we'll see together in a few minutes, but I use a lot of wood grain, found wood grain, and build it over transparent layers in order to kind of build up an atmosphere, a room for, so to say, a room for these situations to exist in. So it kind of brings in that idea of horizon or distance, depth. The separation here, we won't see the land mass itself, but we see these things silhouetted against a sky, knowing that they are, in fact, kind of anchored to the ground. So what I'm going to do is print a really thin layer of ink from this wood grain that I've kind of sanded through and with a wire brush raised onto a, kind of this top layer of Gampi paper. One of the things that I'm using a lot, kind of being a necessary byproduct of my process, is I'm using multiple layers of paper. This is a Japanese Gampi paper on top of another type of Japanese paper. And I'm, like, printmaking, the way I'm, or woodcut, like the way I'm using it is in layers. Layers of color stacked up, and I'm using, taking that a little bit further and saying I'm layering papers themselves with printed information on them, and then allowing them space in between, that they kind of evoke that sense of depth in space, because there is a physical layer, not just of ink, but of paper.
Which, by the way, disciplinary can hide my background resonates very well with me as far as architecture.
Yeah,
the
clearly.
layering
And we both deal with space. We're both dealing with an awareness and desire to use space in a way that people recognize it, and that it's a functionable space. It's not just an aesthetic space. It's really something that's functioning. In my pictures, it functions as a depth that one can look into, and you could certainly speak eloquently about how you use space in your own process of architecture. So we'll turn this paper over. We'll be printing on the front side of this paper. So we see here that there's already several layers of printed ink on there. And this time I'm going to be not using the press, but I'm going to be using that Japanese hand baron. This little bamboo disc.
that you showed us before in theory.
Right.
Now it's in practice.
Now we're going to see it in practice. And with this, the advent is that I can transfer some of that wood grain only in the areas that I want it to be in. So again, this barrier sheet is really important. I'm not putting a lot of pressure because I just want a hint, a subtle kind of hint of this color showing up in the print. Sometimes I print as many as 20 colors in this just to kind of build that atmosphere up, and it is dictated on what the print needs as an image that kind of evolves over the process or through the process, and maybe what time of, if it's time-based, then it's what time of day that might be, or or as a contrast to other elements that are in the print. So we're barely going to be able to see this. It's a very, very transparent color. But what we can do is pan to that in a few minutes and take a look at how that little bit of information sitting on top of the other starts to push that that background further back and brings the things in the foreground to the front. I collect wooden boards out of rubbish bins. I have a nice collection from kind of all over the place.
Great. Yeah, I wanted to show that or point that out. Some of that stuff is here in the back, which just impressed me the most. How, you use, as you call it, found objects or found wood, right? So found objects.
Well, wood responds to time.
Yeah.
It's like a physical body, I'm finding that my eyes are responding to time, and you know, we have one of my favorite boards is from the stairs here. We had to replace one of the stairs. This part of the building was built in the early 18th century, parts of it in the 17th century, and you know, there's been generations of feet that have gone up those stairs. This was actually the kind of a hayloft for the coaches, the horse coaches that would be downstairs. So there's, you know, there's this palimpsest of human activity and natural process that informs those boards. You know, that's nice for me to know, but it doesn't show up in the picture, nor is it important as an aspect of the philosophical aspects of the paper or of the print. I'm saying.
Well, I mean,
It
that
can
might
be.
be questionable,
It
right?
could be,
because
right?
I mean, because it's so driven by you know, what drives you doing this, right? And maybe it's all this memory, all this awareness of all that history that makes your hand doing what it's doing, right?
Right.
So it is not in a sort of a, you know, we just talked during the break about they were so driven by science and by evidence-based, you know, answer seeking, but it might be that intuitive that makes your art so powerful, you know.
I think it's also, you know, we have our interest, and when we're kind of true to those things, then our intellect plays with our interest. Our eye informs and edifies that and looks for those things to continue that dialogue. So, you know, it's kind of, it's a process of becoming more and more aware of the things that we're doing. So, and here you kind of see is the, you know, this is a kind of the edition laid out. So each one is quite similar from first look, and then when you can set them next to one another, you'll start seeing that, you know, here's a little bit more gray than here, a little bit more blue, or here that red is darker than here. So I do play with that kind of flexibility of the things. I mean, it's a malleable process. I can add more pressure or less pressure, more ink, less ink, change the colors. I try not to get dogmatic about any of this process, and try to keep it open.
Great.
So, Federica and I are often talking about the similar situations in our artwork, or similar connections, but we do that visually very differently, and we think visually very differently. So it's interesting to work in this space together, because you know, we're often surprised, and yeah, we help each other out. So it's a nice room for that. It's very intimate here. It was our first apartment. You know, our son we brought him home here just a few hours after he was born. So his first night was in this room.
Yeah, no, I remember all that, what you said, that was part of your tour last year, and actually your wife and you were showing your work, and one can feel that kind of positive, you know, influence and tension, and yeah.
And one thing to keep us also very active and kind of questioning is that I leave my work out during the week, and we might have up to 25 kids in the studio, and then we have adult courses, so there's always kind of some comments that are being made. Either I hear them or Federica hears them and kind of tells me about it when it's poignant. So there's the room is very much alive. So it's working out pretty good for us here. The way that I work, I generally work in series. So this is a series of prints where, again, there's a plant-based motif, and then a geometric. Here, since this might be interesting, it's based on proportional systems. So everything in here is pi, basically. You have the relationship from the width to the length here, and you can actually find those patterns within nature. So the dimensions of the paper itself to one another, the piece to the other, those are all things that I'm thinking about mathematically as well, at a very neophyte stage. But it does come in proportion, since I'm dealing with nature on trying to understand it on different levels, whether that's macro or microscopic, or as part of a system, or one part of a cycle that can't be separated from the other. That mathematical aspect kind of gives a point of beginning, a departure point to say, okay, well, I'm choosing this part of the cycle this time, and next time I can look at the other part of that cycle. But this kind of gives it that gravity of like I said, kind of beginning. My relationship with the computer, which is not at a very sophisticated level, is that you have to have a question to look for information in the computer, and through a process like this you arrive at a question by being involved in a process that does reveal itself over time. So you're responding to things as it evolves and not having a preconception of what the outcome might be. I have a feeling of the image when I start. I have a desire and a wish, but it's an organic process.
I think that makes the work so rich, that the level of stages you have to go through, and that each phase has so many inherent components, right? Of materiality, of craft, of sensuality, of logic, and then overlaying them. It's just, I mean, I really like these works because obviously I have an affinity to it, because there's architecture in there, and this kind of search, almost research, right? In sort of the principles and the pattern and the phenomenon of systems, both as texture and color and perception. Is pretty amazing. Thanks for showing that and sharing that process.
Well, thanks. Thanks for the time today. It's just where I'm at now, and it's really interesting. It's providing some interesting questions to continue making work, and I think that's probably the most positive aspect of the work. It's the thing that it leads you more informed to the next.